Last week, we began hearing the story of Paul. If you remember, Paul was the man who hated the followers of Jesus and loved nothing better than to have them thrown into prison or worse. However, when he met Jesus for himself, he was a truly changed man. He'd been given a fresh start and wanted everyone to know that Jesus could give them a fresh start too. We'll find out what happened in today's story. So if you're ready, let's open the book and listen to Mistaken for God.
Paul never grew tired of talking about Jesus. As soon as he told the people in one town about Jesus, he would move on to the next, and then the next. He wanted everyone to hear about Jesus, the man who had given him a second chance, so that they could have another chance too. One day, when Paul and his friend Barnabas were travelling around telling people about Jesus, they came to the town of Lystra. As usual, they went into the town square, where Paul began to tell the people about Jesus. People of Lystra, I have come here today to tell you the good news about a man named Jesus, the man written about in the Hebrew Scriptures, the man sent by God to change the lives of people like you and me. As he was talking, Paul noticed a man sitting nearby. The man was sitting on the floor because he couldn't walk. In fact, he had never walked because his feet had been damaged from birth. The man was concentrating hard. He listened carefully to everything that Paul was saying. And Paul could see from his face that the man believed what he heard. Paul could tell that the man believed that Jesus could change lives, that Jesus could change his life. So Paul looked straight at the man and shouted, "Stand up!" And do you know, that's exactly what he did. The man who had never walked jumped to his feet and started walking around. "Look at me," he shouted. "Look at me. I can walk, I can jump, I can hop. Look, look, look." The man was so excited that he hopped, skipped and jumped around just like an excited child. When the crowd saw what had happened, they were amazed. They couldn't believe their eyes. The man who had never walked was rushing around from one person to another, shouting, "Look at me!" And look at him they did. The people reckoned that only gods could do such amazing things, so they shouted, "The gods have turned into humans and come to visit us." They thought that Barnabas was Zeus, the king of the Greek gods, and they thought that Paul was Hermes, the messenger of the Greek gods, because he was doing all the talking. They were so convinced that Barnabas and Paul really were Greek gods that the priest arranged a big celebration to honour them. When Paul and Barnabas found out about the celebration, they were so upset they ran out to meet the crowd, shouting, "Men, why are you doing this? We're not gods. We're ordinary men just like you. Don't you know there's only one God, the living God, the God who made the sky, the earth, the sea, and everything in them? The God who blesses you with rain from heaven and makes your crops grow? The God who gives you food and makes your hearts glad." The more Paul spoke, the more convinced the people were that he and Barnabas were Greek gods, and the more they wanted to bow down and worship them. Just then, some Jewish leaders from nearby towns arrived. They didn't like Paul, and they didn't like the things he was teaching. "Listen," they shouted to the crowd. "These men are troublemakers. Stop bowing down to them and get rid of them." The crowd started to throw stones. "Get out!" they yelled. And they kept throwing stones until Paul fell to the ground. Thinking he was dead, they dragged him out of the city. Paul lay on the ground, battered and bruised from the attack. His friends gathered round to see what had happened. Slowly, Paul stood up, brushed the dust off his clothes, and then he and Barnabas left Lystra to continue their good news journey.
Oh dear. Paul and Barnabas really got themselves into trouble, didn't they? The problems began when the lame man began to walk. They knew it was God's power had healed him, but the crowd thought Paul and Barnabas themselves had special powers. But despite all the problems, the two men were determined to carry on. Now, Paul and Barnabas were treated really unfairly at Lystra. It must have been hard for them. They got into trouble when it had been all a misunderstanding. So let's close our eyes and think about the story just for a minute. Now, I'm going to say a prayer, and if you want to make it your prayer, say Amen at the end after me. Dear God, help us to be calm when things go wrong for us, especially when we're misunderstood or treated unfairly. Give us the right words to say, and like Paul and Barnabas, help us not to give up. Amen.